we think we know the past. We picture the medieval world as a dark, backward place, a time of plagues, mud, and superstition. We see its economy as simple: feudal lords, poor peasants, and not much else. We congratulate ourselves on how far we have come. We have global supply chains, instant stock trades, and complex financial instruments. We are modern, we are efficient, we are better, but what if we are wrong? What if, in our rush to build this new world, we threw away some old ideas that actually worked? Ideas that were not about maximizing profit at all costs, but about building stable communities. Ideas that valued people over numbers. Look around today. People are drowning in debt. The gig economy offers flexibility, but little security. Local businesses are crushed by global giants. We feel disconnected from the things we buy and the work we do. Could the answers to some of our biggest modern problems be hiding in the very history we dismissed? Is it possible that a 13th century monk understood something about fair pricing that we have forgotten? Did a medieval guild offer a type of job security that today's freelance worker can only dream of? What if the concept of a shared village green holds a secret to managing our digital world? The past is not as dead as we think. Some of its most forgotten economic ideas are quietly making a comeback. They are showing up in our tech startups, our local communities, and our biggest political debates. They are not coming back because of nostalgia. They are coming back because we need them. Number 19, does making something with your hands still matter? In the medieval world, most things were made by one person, a single pair of hands. A shoemaker did not just stitch soles. He knew the cow the leather came from. He knew the foot of the person who would wear the shoe. His name, his reputation was built into every single pair. There was no assembly line. There was no mass production. There was just the artisan. The master craftsman. This person spent a lifetime honing a skill. They started as an apprentice, learning the basics. They became a journeyman, traveling to learn from other masters. Finally, if they were good enough, they became a master themselves with their own workshop. Their work was their identity. The value of an object was not just in its function, but in the skill and time it represented. The historian Lynn White Jr., in his book Medieval Technology and Social Change, documents how even seemingly simple innovations, like a better horse collar or the spinning wheel, were integrated into this craft-based system, empowering individual producers rather than replacing them. The entire economy was built on this foundation of human-scale production. Then came the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly, one machine could do the work of 100 artisans. The goal was no longer mastery, it was efficiency. It was about making things faster and cheaper. The individual craftsman was replaced by the anonymous factory worker. The unique, handmade object was replaced by the identical, mass-produced product. We gained affordability and convenience, but we lost something important. We lost the connection between the maker and the thing made. We lost the story behind our possessions. The economist Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations from 1776, famously used the example of a pin factory. He celebrated how dividing the labor into 18 distinct steps allowed 10 workers to produce 48,000 pins a day. An individual artisan, he noted, could barely make one. This was the logic that buried the craftsman. It was a logic of pure numbers. But look around now. The artisan is back. You see it on websites like Etsy, a global marketplace for handmade and vintage goods. In 2022, Etsy had over 95 million active buyers. These people are not just looking for the cheapest product. They are looking for something unique, something with a story, something made by a real person. You see it in the rise of craft breweries. The Brewers Association reports there are over 9,000 craft breweries in the United States, up from just a handful a few decades ago. People are willing to pay more for a beer made with local ingredients by someone from their community. It is the same with the slow food movement, which started in Italy in the 1980s as a protest against a new McDonald's opening in Rome. It champions local food traditions and small-scale farming over industrial agriculture. This is not just about nostalgia, it is a reaction against the faceless, soulless nature of mass production. It is a search for authenticity. We are starting to remember that the price of an object is not its only value. The work of thinkers like Matthew B. Crawford in his book Shop Class of Soulcraft, argues that manual labor is a form of thinking, a way of engaging with the world that office work often denies us. We are relearning that making something with your hands matters. So what do we still not know? If artificial intelligence can write code and design products, will human craftsmanship become the last truly valuable form of labor? As our world becomes more digital and virtual, will our hunger for real, tangible, handmade objects only grow stronger? And can an economy built on the idea of endless, cheap consumption ever truly make space for the slow, expensive, and deeply human world of the artisan? Number 18 is all debt meant to be repaid. The idea of a jubilee is ancient, far older than the medieval period, but it was a powerful concept within medieval Christian thought. It comes from the Old Testament, the book of Leviticus. The law stated that every 50 years, all debts were to be forgiven. Slaves were to be set free. Land was to be returned to its original owners. It was a giant reset button for the entire economy. The goal was to prevent a permanent underclass of debtors from forming. It was a recognition that debt, left unchecked, can destroy families and communities. In medieval Europe, this idea was not practiced on a national scale every 50 years, but the principle echoed through society. Kings would sometimes grant debt amnesties. The church preached against trapping people in endless debt. The concept created a moral framework that saw debt not just as a financial contract, but as a social relationship with a dangerous, corrosive potential. The anthropologist David Graeber, in his monumental book, Debt the First 5,000 Years, argues that for most of human history, debt was seen as a flexible social bond, not the rigid mathematical certainty we treat it as today. This idea was completely abandoned with the rise of modern capitalism. The new system was built on credit. The entire economy, from a small business loan to the national debt, runs on the promise that all debts will be repaid with interest. Forgetting a debt became a cardinal sin. It was a moral failure. A person who defaulted on a loan was not just unlucky, they were irresponsible. The sanctity of contract became the bedrock of the financial world. We built complex legal systems and credit rating agencies like the FICO score system developed in the 1950s, all designed to ensure that no debt is ever forgotten. We created debtors' prisons in the 18th and 19th centuries. Today we have wage garnishments and bankruptcy laws that can follow a person for years. The Jubilee became a forgotten fairy tale. It was seen as economically impossible, a recipe for chaos. How could anyone ever lend money if they thought the debt might just be wiped away? But the idea of a Jubilee is coming back, and it is coming back with a vengeance. You hear it most clearly in the debate over student loans. In the United States, student debt has exploded to over $1.7 trillion. Millions of people are starting their adult lives with a burden that prevents them from buying homes, starting families, or taking entrepreneurial risks. The call for widespread student loan forgiveness is, in essence, a call for a modern jubilee. It is a recognition that this level of debt is crushing a generation and acting as a drag on the entire economy. The arguments are not just economic, they are moral. Is it right to burden people for decades for seeking an education? This is not just a fringe idea. It has been a central policy proposal in recent presidential campaigns. Beyond student loans, the concept is being applied to international debt. Calls for forgiving the debts of developing nations, which often spend more on interest payments to foreign banks than on healthcare or education, are growing louder. Organizations like the Jubilee Debt Campaign UK have been fighting for this for decades, arguing that unpayable debt is a primary driver of global poverty. They are taking a medieval religious idea and applying it to 21st century global finance. What are the questions we cannot answer yet? If we forgive a massive amount of student debt, what does that do to the value of a college degree or the future of university funding? Is there a way to have a debt jubilee without causing a massive financial crisis or scaring lenders away from providing credit in the future? And the biggest question of all is a society that allows millions of its people to be trapped in unpayable debt, truly a free society. Number 17, should your town have its own money? In the medieval period, the economy was intensely local. For most people, their entire economic world existed within a few miles of their home. While kings and nobles dealt in gold and silver, ordinary people often used other means of exchange. This included barter, but it also included various forms of local currency. A powerful lord might mint his own coins, valid only in his domain. A specific city or a major fair might issue tokens or script that were trusted within that community. This was not a flaw in the system, it was a feature. It kept wealth circulating within a community. And money earned at the local market was spent at the local blacksmith, who then spent it at the local baker. This created a strong, resilient local economy. The money was tied to the community that used it. It was a tool for local exchange, not an abstract commodity for global speculation. Research by economic historians like Peter Spufford in money and its use in medieval Europe shows a complex tapestry of overlapping currencies where the most important factor was not a national standard but local trust. The rise of the nation-state changed everything. Kings and governments wanted to consolidate power, and a key way to do that was to control the money supply. They created national mints and declared that only their official currency was legal tender. Local currencies were suppressed. This process accelerated with the rise of global trade and finance. Money needed to be standardized. A dollar had to be a dollar, whether you were in New York or London. This gave us a powerful and efficient global economic system, but it also meant that money no longer had any loyalty to a particular place. A dollar earned in a small town could be instantly spent on a product made on the other side of the world, and the wealth would be sucked out of that local community forever. We gained a global marketplace but weakened our local economic foundations. The local butcher cannot compete with the global supermarket, in part because the money system is designed to favor the global. Now, the idea of local currency is making a surprising comeback. You can see it in places like Bristol in the United Kingdom, which launched the Bristol pound in 2012. It was a citywide currency with its own printed notes and electronic payment systems. The goal was simple: to keep money circulating within Bristol. You could use it to pay local taxes, buy groceries from local shops, and ride the bus. Every Bristol pound spent could only be spent again within the city, strengthening local businesses and fostering a sense of community identity. Similar schemes have emerged all over the world. The Berkshires program in Western Massachusetts has been running since 2006. In Germany and Switzerland, regional currencies are widespread. This is not just about quaint local pride. It is an economic strategy. Proponents argue it makes communities more resilient to national economic shocks. If the national currency is in crisis, the local economy can keep functioning. With the rise of blockchain technology, some see a future for digital local currencies, or community coins that could be even easier to manage and use. They are a 21st century version of a medieval idea. But what are the real unknowns here? Can local currencies ever be more than a niche project, or will they always be overshadowed by powerful national currencies? If a local currency becomes too successful, does it risk cutting a community off from the wider national and global economy? And perhaps the most unsettling question, if money is what we trust, what does it say about our society that we are starting to trust our neighbors more than our national governments? Number 16. Should the law stop you from buying things? We live in a world of consumerism. The message we hear constantly is buy more. New phone, new car, new clothes. Our economy is built on the idea of endless growth, which requires endless consumption. The freedom to buy what you want, when you want it, is seen as a basic right. The idea of the government telling you what you can or cannot buy seems absurd, an infringement on personal liberty. But for much of history, this was completely normal. In medieval Europe, many countries had what were called sumptuary laws. These were laws designed to regulate consumption. They dictated what people of different social classes could wear, eat, and own. A merchant's wife, for example, might be forbidden from wearing the same expensive silk or purple dye as a duchess. A peasant might be restricted to wearing simple wool or linen. The number of courses you could serve at a dinner party could be legally defined by your social rank. The justification for these laws was complex. It was partly about enforcing the social hierarchy, but it was also about morality and economics. The church preached against the sin of envy and extravagance, and leaders worried that spending on foreign luxuries was draining wealth out of the kingdom. They believed that conspicuous consumption was a social and economic poison. The historian Susan Mosher Stewart's work on medieval women highlights how these laws were often targeted at controlling female consumption, tying economic regulation directly to social control. The Enlightenment and the rise of capitalism swept these ideas away. Thinkers like Adam Smith argued that individual self-interest and the freedom to consume were the engines of economic progress. My desire for a luxury good creates jobs for the people who make and sell it. Restricting consumption was seen as restricting economic growth. The idea of consumer sovereignty took hold. The customer is king, and their desires should drive the market. Sumptuary laws came to be seen as ridiculous, oppressive, and economically foolish. The last of them were repealed in the 18th and 19th centuries. We entered an age where the only limit on what you could buy was the amount of money you had. Freedom became defined in part as the freedom to shop. But the ghost of the sumptuary law is returning in a new form. This time, it is not dressed in the language of social class or religious morality, but in the language of public health and environmental sustainability. Think of the syntaxes placed on tobacco and alcohol. These are designed to make these products more expensive and discourage consumption. Many cities and countries are now imposing taxes on sugary drinks to combat obesity and diabetes. These are modern sumptuary laws. They use price as a tool to shape consumer behavior for the common good. The logic extends to the environment. Carbon taxes, which make it more expensive to buy gasoline or use electricity from fossil fuels, are a form of sumptuary law. They are designed to punish consumption that harms the planet. There are calls for fast fashion taxes to discourage the culture of cheap, disposable clothing that fills our landfills. We are no longer telling people they cannot wear silk because they are not a noble. But we are starting to tell them that they should not buy a gas-guzzling SUV because it damages the shared environment. It is the same core idea. Individual consumption has social consequences, and sometimes it needs to be regulated. This raises some deeply uncomfortable questions. In a democracy, who gets to decide what is a good or bad form of consumption? Is it fair to use taxes that disproportionately affect the poor, who spend a larger percentage of their income on things like gasoline and soda? And as we face environmental crises, will we see the return of outright bans on certain products, moving from taxation to prohibition? How much personal freedom are we willing to trade for collective survival? Number 15, is your boss supposed to take care of you? The modern concept of a job is a simple transaction. You sell your time and skills to an employer in exchange for a wage. Your employer is not your family. They are not your friend. Their primary obligation is to pay you for the work you do. If the company is not doing well, or if they can find someone cheaper, they can lay you off. This is the logic of the free market. It is efficient and flexible. This idea is so normal to us that it is hard to imagine anything else. But this is not how it always worked. In the medieval feudal system, the relationship between a lord and the peasants who worked his land was not just a simple economic transaction. It was a web of mutual obligations. The peasant owed the lord labor and a share of the harvest. But the lord, in turn, owed the peasant protection. He was expected to defend them from bandits or invading armies. He was expected to maintain a grain store to help them survive a famine. He was supposed to provide a basic level of justice and order. This was not a system of equals. It was deeply hierarchical and often brutal. But it contained a core idea that has been lost. The person with power had a responsibility for the well-being of the people who worked for them. This concept, known as noblesse oblige, or nobility obligates, meant that wealth and power came with duties, not just privileges. The economic historian Georges Duby described this as a system where every person had a defined place and a set of reciprocal duties, creating a harsh but stable social order. The industrial age and the rise of wage labor shattered this system of mutual obligation. The factory owner's only legal duty to his workers was to pay them their wages. If a worker got sick, injured on the job, or grew old, that was their problem. This new system was celebrated for creating freedom. Workers were no longer tied to the land. They were free to sell their labor to the highest bidder. But it was a cold and unforgiving freedom. The social safety net, which had been informally provided by the lord or the local community, was gone. It took centuries of struggle, the rise of unions, and government intervention to create the modern welfare state with things like unemployment insurance, social security, and workplace safety regulations. We had to build a new impersonal system to replace the old personal one. But the old idea of employer responsibility is making a comeback in unexpected ways. In the competitive tech industry, companies are not just offering high salaries. They are offering free food, on-site healthcare, childcare assistance, and generous parental leave. They are acting less like simple employers and more like benevolent patrons. Why? Because in a knowledge economy, they are in a fierce competition for talent. They know that to attract and retain the best people, they need to offer more than just a paycheck. They need to offer a supportive environment. This is a pragmatic, business-driven version of noblesse oblige. Similarly, the rise of B corporations or benefit corporations is a move in this direction. These are companies that are legally required to consider the impact of their decisions on their workers, customers, suppliers, community, and the environment. There are now over 6,000 B Corp across 87 countries. This is a formal legal rejection of the idea that a company's only responsibility is to its shareholders. It is a return to the medieval idea that a powerful economic entity has obligations to the entire community. This trend leaves us with some big unanswered questions. Are these corporate perks just a cynical trick to make employees work longer hours, a golden cage rather than a real safety net? Can we ever rely on the voluntary kindness of corporations, or do we always need government regulations and strong unions to truly protect workers? And in a globalized economy where companies can easily move to countries with fewer regulations, can the idea of employer responsibility ever be a global standard, or will it always be a luxury for a privileged few? Number 14 is time something you can own. Time is money. This phrase, often attributed to Benjamin Franklin in 1748, is the unofficial motto of the modern economy. We see time as a resource. It is something to be managed, optimized, and sold. We have hourly wages, billable hours, and time management apps. We talk about spending time and wasting time. Our entire economic system is built on the idea that time is a personal commodity. You own your time, and you can sell it to an employer. The more efficiently you use it, the more valuable it becomes. This seems natural, almost a law of physics, but it is a very new idea. In the medieval world, time did not belong to the individual. It belonged to God and the community. The day was not divided into minutes and seconds, but by the rhythm of the church bells, which called people to prayer. These were the canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. The seasons, marked by religious festivals, and the agricultural calendar dictated the rhythm of the year. The historian Jacques Le Goff, in his book Time, Work, and Culture in the Middle Ages, argued that the invention of the mechanical clock in the 14th century was one of the most revolutionary changes of the era. For the first time, it allowed merchants to measure time precisely, to separate it from the natural and religious rhythms, and to turn it into something that could be bought and sold. This was the birth of merchants' time. The ancestor of our time is money. The idea that time is a public good, a shared rhythm rather than a private commodity, was completely lost. The factory whistle replaced the church bell. The time clock replaced the sun. The goal was to extract the maximum amount of labor from each unit of time. This led to the 8-hour workday, a hard-won victory for the labor movement, but one that still accepted the basic premise that our time is for sale. The 24/7 global economy powered by the internet has pushed this to its extreme. We are now expected to be available at all times. Emails arrive at midnight. Work bleeds into evenings and weekends. The line between work time and personal time has all but disappeared. We are all on the clock all the time, but there is a growing backlash. A movement is underway to reclaim time as a public good. The most prominent example is the push for a 4-day work week. Trials around the world, from Iceland to the UK, have shown that when companies move to a 4-day week with no cut in pay, productivity often stays the same or even improves, while employee stress and burnout plummet. This is a radical rejection of the time is money logic. It suggests that more hours do not necessarily equal more value. In countries like France and Spain, they have introduced right to disconnect laws, which make it illegal for employers to expect their employees to answer emails or calls after work hours. This is a legal attempt to rebuild the wall between work time and personal time. These are not just policies about work-life balance. They are a fundamental challenge to the commodification of our lives. They are an attempt to restore the idea that some of our time should belong to ourselves, our families, and our communities, and that it is not for sale at any price. So what happens next if a 4-day work week becomes standard? How does that change the very nature of consumption, leisure, and community life? As AI and automation handle more tasks, will we see the value of human labor shift from hours worked to problems solved, making the time clock obsolete? And the most profound question, if we stop believing that time is money, what do we start believing it is instead? Number 13, should your word be your bond? Today's economy runs on paper and digital paper. We have long, complicated contracts for everything. Getting a job, renting an apartment, even installing a new app on your phone requires you to agree to pages of terms and conditions that nobody reads. Our system is built on the assumption that people cannot be trusted, so we need lawyers and courts to enforce agreements. A deal is not a deal until the contract is signed. This creates a huge amount of friction and cost. It also creates a culture of adversarial relationships. We assume the other side is trying to trick us, so we hire experts to protect ourselves. This is the world of transactional trust. Trust is placed in the legal document, not in the person. This would have seemed very strange to a medieval merchant. Of course, there were written contracts in the Middle Ages, especially for large, complex deals. But for a huge amount of everyday business, the most important technology was reputation. In a world without fast travel or communication, a merchant's good name was his most valuable asset. If you were known as someone who broke your promises or cheated your partners, word would get around. Soon, nobody would trade with you, your business would die. A handshake and a sworn oath in front of witnesses were often more powerful than a written document. This was a system of relational trust. Trust was built up over time through repeated interactions within a community. Economic historians like Avner Greif have studied the Maghribi traders of the 11th century. These Jewish merchants operating across the Mediterranean developed a sophisticated system for punishing cheaters through collective ostracism. If a merchant in one city cheated another, agents in every other city would be notified and would refuse to do business with him. This informal, reputation-based system allowed them to conduct long-distance trade with a high degree of security long before modern contract law existed. The modern world, with its global scale and anonymous transactions, made this system seem obsolete. You cannot build a relationship of trust with a call center operator on the other side of the world. You cannot rely on the reputation of an anonymous seller on Amazon, so we replaced personal reputation with impersonal systems, credit scores, legal contracts, and online review platforms. We created complex regulations and enforcement agencies. This system allows for a massive scale of economic activity, but it comes at a cost. It is slow, expensive, and it can make simple interactions feel fraught with suspicion. But we are seeing a fascinating return to the economics of reputation, powered by the very technology that made the old system obsolete. Think about eBay, Uber, or Airbnb. The entire business model of these platforms rests on a digital version of medieval reputation. You do not get into a stranger's car or stay in their house because you have a signed contract. You do it because they have a 4.9-star rating and 100 positive reviews. A seller on eBay with a long history of positive feedback can command higher prices. A freelance web developer with a portfolio of glowing testimonials on a platform like Upwork will get more work. We are using technology to rebuild relational trust at a global scale. Blockchain technology with its public, unchangeable ledgers is another example. A smart contract is a piece of code that automatically executes the terms of an agreement, creating a new kind of trustless system that does not rely on lawyers or courts. It is an attempt to create the certainty of a sworn oath using mathematics. This leaves us with some critical questions. What happens when our digital reputations become more important than our real-world identities? Are we creating a new, unforgiving social credit system where one mistake can follow you forever? And can these new systems of digital trust really replace the nuance and flexibility of human relationships? Or are they just a brittle imitation of the real thing? Number 12 is greed good. The modern capitalist economy is built on a very specific idea about human nature. The idea most famously articulated by Adam Smith is that individual self-interest, or greed, can be a force for good. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, Smith wrote in 1776, but from their regard to their own interest. The pursuit of profit, in this view, is what motivates people to innovate, work hard, and provide the goods and services that society needs. This idea was a radical departure from what came before. For centuries in medieval Europe, the dominant moral framework was that of the Catholic Church, and the Church was deeply suspicious of wealth and profit. Greed, or avarice, was one of the seven deadly sins. The pursuit of wealth for its own sake was seen as spiritually dangerous. A rich man, the Bible taught, would have as much trouble getting into heaven as a camel passing through the eye of a needle. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas spent a great deal of time thinking about economics. He developed the theory of the just price. The idea was that an item had a correct price based on the cost of labor and materials. To sell something for more than the just price was a sin. It was a form of theft. To lend money at interest, known as usury, was also condemned. The goal of economic life was not to accumulate as much wealth as possible, but to maintain a stable and just social order. This entire moral framework was dismantled to make way for the modern world. The idea of a just price was replaced by the law of supply and demand. The price is whatever the market will bear. The condemnation of usury was replaced by a global financial system that runs on interest. The sin of greed was rebranded as the virtue of ambition. This shift in thinking, brilliantly chronicled by the sociologist Max Weber in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, was essential for the development of the modern economy. It unleashed a wave of innovation and economic growth that has lifted billions of people out of poverty. But it also came with a dark side. An economy that celebrates self-interest can lead to staggering inequality, environmental destruction, and financial crises driven by unchecked speculation. Now, after centuries of dominance, the idea that greed is good is facing a serious challenge. We are seeing a powerful resurgence of the medieval concept of a just economy. You can see it in the fair trade movement. When you buy fair trade coffee, you are paying a premium to ensure that the farmer who grew it received a fair, or just, price for their labor, not just the lowest price the market would allow. This is Thomas Aquinas' philosophy in a coffee cup. You can see it in the movement for a living wage. The argument is that the minimum wage set by supply and demand is often not enough for a person to live on with dignity. A living wage is a modern version of the just price applied to labor. You see it in the rise of impact investing, where people choose to invest their money not just for the highest financial return, but in companies that have a positive social or environmental impact. This is a direct rejection of the idea that profit is the only goal. These are all attempts to re-embed a moral and ethical dimension into economic activity. But this raises fundamental and difficult questions. Who gets to decide what is just or fair in a complex global economy? Can an economy based on justice and fairness ever be as innovative and dynamic as one based on self-interest? And the most challenging question of all, are we willing to accept a lower standard of living, to have fewer and more expensive things, in order to live in a more just and equitable world? Number 11. Who really owns the land? In our modern world, we think of land as a commodity. It's just something you can buy, sell, and own, just like a car or a television. The idea of private property is central to our legal and economic systems. You own a piece of land, you get a deed, and it is yours to do with as you please within the limits of zoning laws. This gives you security and an incentive to invest in and improve your property. It seems like the most natural system in the world, but for most of the medieval period, this concept would have been very strange. Under the feudal system, nobody really owned land in the modern sense. The king might claim ultimate ownership of the entire kingdom, but he granted control of large tracts of it to his most powerful nobles. These nobles, in turn, granted smaller parcels to lesser lords or knights, and at the bottom, the peasants worked the land. Everyone had rights to the land, but nobody had absolute ownership. The peasant had the right to farm the land and live on it. The lord had the right to a share of the crop and military service. The king had the right to loyalty and taxes. It was a system of stewardship, not ownership. The land was not a commodity to be traded, but the foundation of the entire social structure, a trust to be held and passed down through generations. This idea is captured in the work of legal historians like Frederick Maitland, who showed how complex and layered medieval land rights were, a far cry from our simple idea of absolute ownership. The modern idea of private property in land emerged slowly through processes like the enclosure movement in England, which began in the late medieval period and accelerated over centuries. Common lands were fenced off and turned into the private property of wealthy landlords. Peasants who had farmed that land for generations were driven off, forced to move to the cities to become factory workers. This was a brutal and controversial process, but it was essential for the creation of both modern agriculture and the industrial workforce. The idea of land as a tradable asset became the foundation of real estate markets and the mortgage industry. We gained economic efficiency, but lost the idea of land as a shared resource that we have a duty to care for. But the medieval idea of stewardship is making a comeback, driven by the environmental crisis. The modern farming system, which treats land as an input for maximizing production, has led to soil degradation, water pollution, and a loss of biodiversity. In response, we are seeing the rise of movements like regenerative agriculture and permaculture. These are farming philosophies that see the land not as a factory, but as a living ecosystem. The goal is not just to take from the land, but to heal it, to build up the soil, and to work with natural systems. This is a return to the idea of stewardship. It is farming as if you intend to pass the land on to future generations in better condition than you found it. We are also seeing new models of land tenure that challenge the idea of absolute private ownership. Community land trusts, for example, are nonprofit organizations that acquire land and hold it in trust for a community. They can then sell or lease the homes on the land to residents at affordable prices, but the trust retains ownership of the land itself. This separates the value of the building from the speculative value of the land, keeping housing affordable in perpetuity. It is a modern legal structure that echoes the medieval idea of separating the use of the land from its absolute ownership. This leads to some truly fundamental questions. If we start to treat land as a community trust rather than a private commodity, what does that do to the real estate market and the wealth that millions of people hold in their homes? Can we feed a global population of 8 billion people with small-scale regenerative agriculture? And the biggest question, do we, as a species, have the right to own the planet? Or are we just temporary stewards with a profound responsibility to those who will come after us? Number 10. Should you have to train your replacement? The path to a good career today is often seen as a straight line. You go to school, you get a degree, you get an entry-level job, and you work your way up. Your training is something you acquire before you start working, and you pay for it yourself, often by taking on massive debt. Your employer hires you for the skills you already have. They are not typically in the business of teaching you a profession from scratch. This is a very different model from the one that dominated the medieval economy for centuries, the apprenticeship. If you wanted to become a skilled craftsman, a blacksmith, a weaver, a stonemason, you did not go to university. You became an apprentice. At a young age, often as a boy, you would leave your family and go to live with a master craftsman. You would agree to work for the master for a set number of years, typically 7. In exchange, the master would provide you with food, housing, and, most importantly, a complete education in their craft. You would start with the most menial task, sweeping the floor and fetching materials. Slowly, you would be given more responsibility, learning every aspect of the trade through hands-on work. At the end of your term, you would become a journeyman, and perhaps one day a master yourself. This system, formalized by the guilds, was the primary way that skills and knowledge were passed down through generations. The historian Stephen A. Epstein's work, Wage and Labor in Late Medieval Europe, details how this system was not just about job training, it was a form of social welfare and education, all rolled into one. The apprenticeship system faded with the rise of factories and mass education. Factories did not need highly skilled master craftsmen. They needed workers who could perform a single repetitive task. The skills required were so simple, they could be learned in a few hours, not 7 years. The new public school systems were designed to provide a basic education for everyone, but not specific job training. Universities focused on academic and professional knowledge, not hands-on skills. The responsibility for training shifted from the employer to the individual and the state. Apprenticeship came to be seen as a relic, something for old-fashioned trades, not for the modern economy. But we are now realizing that we have a massive skills gap. Our education system is producing plenty of people with academic degrees, but we have a shortage of people with the practical, technical skills needed for many well-paying jobs in fields like advanced manufacturing, healthcare, and information technology. And so the apprenticeship model is being reinvented for the 21st century. In countries like Germany and Switzerland, a robust apprenticeship system has never gone away. A large percentage of young people go directly from school into programs that combine classroom learning with paid on-the-job training. They graduate with a valuable qualification and no student debt. Now, other countries are trying to catch up. The United States and the United Kingdom are investing heavily in creating new apprenticeship programs, not just in traditional trades, but in high-tech fields. As companies are starting degree apprenticeships, where a young person can earn a full university degree while working, with the company paying their tuition. Tech boot camps, which provide intensive short-term training for jobs like coding, are another modern twist on the apprenticeship idea. They focus on practical skills and a direct path to a job. This revival of an old idea forces us to ask some important questions. Should a university degree continue to be the default path for young people, or should we create a parallel, equally respected system based on apprenticeship? Can the apprenticeship model work for the complex knowledge-based jobs of the future, or is it only suited for hands-on skills? And what is the fundamental responsibility of an employer to simply hire existing talent, or to actively invest in creating the skilled workforce of the next generation? Number 9, what if your job was a lifelong community? For most people in the modern world, a job is a contract with a company. The company itself is a legal and financial entity designed to make a profit for its shareholders. Your colleagues are the people who happen to work there at the same time as you. When you leave the company, those relationships often fade. There is little sense of a shared identity or a lifelong community. The gig economy has taken this to its logical extreme. The Uber driver or the freelance designer is not even an employee. They are an independent contractor, an army of one. This system is flexible and dynamic, but it can also be isolating and insecure. The medieval world had a very different institution at the heart of its urban economy, the guild. A guild was an association of all the artisans or merchants in a particular trade within a town. The Weavers Guild, the Goldsmiths Guild, the Bakers Guild, these organizations had immense power. They were part job, part union, part social club, and part government. The guild set the standards for quality. If you made a shoddy product, the guild could fine you or even expel you. The guild controlled who could practice the trade through the apprenticeship system. This limited competition and kept wages and prices stable. But the guild did much more than that. It was a social safety net. If a guild member fell ill, the guild would support him and his family. When a member died, the guild paid for the funeral and supported his widow and orphans. Guilds organized religious festivals, sponsored plays, and built magnificent guild halls that were the center of civic life. Like, to be a member of a guild was to belong to a community for life. The work of historians like Sheila Ogilvy, while critical of the guild's monopolistic practices, also documents their deep social and political roles in medieval life. Guilds were eventually destroyed for two main reasons. First, economists like Adam Smith saw them as cartels that stifled competition and innovation. They kept prices high and prevented new people with new ideas from entering a trade. The rising philosophy of the free market was fundamentally opposed to the guild's restrictions. Second, national governments saw them as a rival source of power. They wanted to control the economy themselves. So, over time, the guilds were stripped of their powers and eventually disappeared. We gained economic dynamism and individual freedom, but we lost a powerful source of community and social solidarity. But now, in a world of precarious work and social isolation, we are seeing the spontaneous creation of new kinds of guilds. Look at the world of open source software. A project like Linux or Python is maintained by a global community of developers. They are not employed by a single company. They are bound by a shared passion and a commitment to quality. They have strict rules for how code is contributed and reviewed. They mentor newcomers. They have a strong sense of shared identity. This is a digital guild. Look at the indie web movement, a community of creators trying to build their own websites and social networks outside the control of big tech companies. Look at the unions and associations being formed by gig workers like Uber drivers and food delivery couriers. They are banding together to demand better pay, benefits, and working conditions. They are trying to recreate the collective power and social solidarity of the old guilds in the face of a new and powerful economic system. Professional associations for doctors, lawyers, and engineers also carry on some of the guild's functions, setting standards and controlling entry into the profession. This raises some very modern questions. In an economy dominated by giant global corporations, can these new style guilds provide a meaningful counterbalance of power for individuals? Is it possible to have the community and security of the guild without the monopolistic practices that stifle innovation? And as more of our work becomes remote and atomized, will our human need for community force us to reinvent the guild in forms we cannot yet imagine? Number 8. Who should be helped in a disaster? When a disaster strikes today, a hurricane, an earthquake, a financial crisis, we expect the government to step in. We have national disaster relief agencies, unemployment insurance, and central banks that can inject money into the financial system. The idea is that in a major crisis, the responsibility for helping people falls on a large, centralized public institution. The help is often impersonal, based on rules and applications. It is a massive top-down response. The medieval world had no such institutions. If a harvest failed and a famine struck, or if a fire swept through a town, there was no national government to call for help. The response was almost entirely local and was often organized by the church. The key economic institution here was the monastery. For centuries, monasteries were not just places of prayer. They were major economic engines. They were often the largest landowners in a region. They ran huge agricultural operations with watermills, breweries, and workshops. They had large storehouses primarily for their own needs, but a core part of their religious and social duty was charity, or alms. In a time of crisis, the monastery was expected to open its storehouses to feed the hungry. It was the medieval equivalent of a disaster relief agency. This system was based on a moral and religious obligation, not a legal one. The church taught that giving to the poor was a duty and a path to salvation. This charitable function was central to the church's power and legitimacy. Historians like Barbara H. Tuchman, in A Distant Mirror, describe how the breakdown of these traditional social structures during the calamities of the 14th century, like the Black Death and the Hundred Years' War, led to widespread chaos. The system was not perfect, but it was the only safety net that existed. This model of charity as a primary economic pillar was swept away by the Reformation and the rise of the secular state. Protestant reformers were often suspicious of the wealth and power of the monasteries. In countries like England, King Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries in the 1530s and seized their vast wealth. This was a massive transfer of assets from the church to the state and private landowners. One of the unintended consequences was the collapse of the traditional social safety net. With the monasteries gone, the problem of poverty and vagrancy exploded. This forced the state to step in and create the first systems of public welfare, like the English Poor Laws. The responsibility for care shifted from the religious institution to the secular government. Charity became a private, voluntary act, while the real safety net was a function of the state. But now we are seeing a fascinating blurring of these lines. The old idea of an economic enterprise with a core social or religious mission is back. We see it in the rise of social enterprises and B corporations, which we have already discussed. We also see it in the concept of effective altruism, a philosophical and social movement that uses evidence and reason to determine the most effective ways to help others. This movement, championed by thinkers like Peter Singer, encourages people, including highly paid professionals in finance and tech, to donate a significant portion of their income to the most effective charities. It is a data-driven, secular version of the medieval idea of tithing. We also see it in the model of companies like Tom's Shoes, which for a long time operated on a one-for-one model, donating a pair of shoes for every pair sold. While the model has been criticized and has since evolved, it represents an attempt to embed a charitable mission directly into the business model. It is a move away from the idea that a company's only job is to make a profit, and charity is something you do on the side. It is a return to the monastic idea that an economic enterprise can have a soul. This trend leaves us with some puzzling questions. Can we ever truly trust a for-profit company to have a social mission, or will the profit motive always win out in the end? Does the rise of these new models let the government off the hook from its responsibility to provide a robust social safety net for all its citizens? And in a world where some billionaires have more wealth than entire countries, are we entering a new feudal age where we rely on the charitable whims of the super rich rather than the democratic decisions of the state? Number 7. Should we all share a digital village green? In the heart of almost every medieval village was a piece of land that nobody owned and everybody used. This was the commons. It was a shared pasture where any villager could graze their cows or sheep. It was the woods where they could gather firewood. It was the stream where they could water their animals. The commons was an essential part of the medieval economy. It provided a safety net for the poorest members of the community. Even if you owned no land yourself, you could survive because you had access to the shared resources of the commons. This was not a free-for-all. The community had complex rules, often unwritten, about how the commons could be used. You could not graze so many sheep that you destroyed the pasture for everyone else. These rules were developed over centuries and enforced by the community itself. It was a system of shared resource management. The idea of the commons was famously declared a tragedy by the ecologist Garrett Hardin in a 1968 paper called The Tragedy of the Commons. He argued that any shared resource will inevitably be destroyed. Each individual has an incentive to take as much as they can for themselves. The rational herdsman will add one more sheep to the pasture and then one more, because he gets the full benefit of that sheep, while the cost of overgrazing is shared by everyone. The result, Hardin argued, is ruin for all. This logic was used to justify the enclosure of the commons. The solution was to privatize the resource. If one person owned the pasture, they would have an incentive to manage it sustainably. The idea of the commons came to be seen as a recipe for disaster, a romantic but unworkable idea. But in 2009, the political economist Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in Economics for proving that Hardin was wrong. She spent her career studying how real communities around the world manage common resources, from forests in Nepal to irrigation systems in Spain. She found that the tragedy was not inevitable. Communities can and do create durable institutions and rules to manage shared resources sustainably, without privatization or top-down government control. She showed that the medieval villagers were not fools, they were sophisticated resource managers. Ostrom's work gave new life to the idea of the commons, and now the most vibrant and important commons are not physical but digital. Think of Wikipedia. It is a massive encyclopedia, more comprehensive than any that has ever existed. It is written and edited by millions of volunteers. Nobody owns it. It is a shared resource for all of humanity. Think of open source software like the Linux operating system or the Apache web server. They are built and maintained by a global community of programmers. They are free for anyone to use, study, and modify. This software powers a huge portion of the internet, including the servers of giant corporations like Google and Amazon. The Creative Commons license is another example. It allows artists, writers, and musicians to share their work freely with the public while still retaining some rights. These are all 21st century digital commons. They are creating immense value, not through private ownership and market exchange, but through sharing and collaboration. They are managed, just like the medieval commons, by a set of community-enforced rules and norms. But this raises new and urgent questions for our time. Can our digital commons survive in an internet that is increasingly dominated by a few powerful, privately owned platforms like Google, Facebook, and Amazon? As artificial intelligence becomes more powerful, who will own the vast datasets of human knowledge and creativity that these systems are trained on? Will they be a new commons or the private property of tech companies? And is it possible to build a future economy where value is created not just by what we own, but by what we choose to share? Number 6, do we need a city-state alliance for the 21st century? When we think of medieval politics, we often think of kings and kingdoms, but for a significant part of Europe, the most important political and economic entities were not kingdoms, but free cities. In cities like Venice, Genoa, Florence, and the cities of the Hanseatic League in Northern Europe were independent or semi-independent powers. They controlled their own trade, minted their own coins, and had their own armies and navies. To protect their economic interests, these cities formed powerful alliances. The most famous of these was the Hanseatic League. At its height in the 14th century, this was a confederation of merchant guilds and their market towns, dominating trade along the coasts of Northern Europe. It was not a country, it had no king and no capital, it was a network. A merchant from a Hansa city like Lübeck or Hamburg was guaranteed trading rights and legal protection in other member cities like London or Bruges. They pooled their resources to build lighthouses, train pilots, and even wage war against pirates or troublesome kings who interfered with their trade. It was an economic and military alliance based on the shared interests of cities, not the ambitions of monarchs. The historian Fernand Braudel marveled at these city-centered economies that for a time were more powerful and dynamic than the larger territorial states. This world of powerful city-states and their leagues was crushed by the rise of the modern nation-state. Their kings and their governments consolidated power, creating centralized armies, legal systems, and national economies. The cities lost their independence and became subordinate parts of a larger country. International relations became a matter for national governments, not city councils. The Hanseatic League faded into history. The idea that a city could have its own foreign or economic policy became almost unthinkable. Global politics was a game played by nations, but we are now entering what the political scientist Benjamin Barber called an age of if mayors ruled the world. He argued that nation-states are often dysfunctional, trapped in partisan gridlock and ancient rivalries. Cities, on the other hand, are pragmatic. Mayors have to fix real problems like garbage collection, public transport, and housing. They are laboratories of innovation, and now cities are starting to bypass their national governments and form their own global alliances, just like the Hanseatic League. The most powerful example is in the fight against climate change. The C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group is a network of nearly 100 of the world's megacities committed to taking bold action on climate change. This network, which includes cities like London, New York, Paris, and Tokyo, allows mayors to share strategies, make joint commitments, and leverage their collective economic power to drive change. When a national government pulls out of an international climate agreement, as the US did from the Paris Agreement in 2017, a network of its own cities can band together and pledge to meet the targets anyway. We are also seeing city-to-city cooperation on issues like technology, immigration, and public health. This is a new Hanseatic League built on fiber optic cables instead of sailing ships. This new reality prompts some startling questions. As cities become more economically powerful and globally connected, will their loyalty shift from their own nation-states to their global city networks? Could we see the emergence of a new kind of global politics, where the competition is not between countries like the USA and China, but between city clusters like the Boston, New York, Washington corridor and the Pearl River Delta in China? And what happens to the billions of people who do not live in these elite, globally connected megacities? Will they be left behind in a new global order? Number 5 is staying put or radical act. Our modern economy is obsessed with mobility. We are encouraged to move for education, to move for a better job, to move to a city with more opportunities. Go West, young man was the slogan of the 19th century. Move to Silicon Valley is the slogan of the 21st. The ability to pull up stakes and move is seen as a key to individual success. Economists see a mobile labor force as essential for a dynamic and efficient economy. People move from areas with no jobs to areas with job growth. This seems entirely positive. The flip side is that communities that lose people are left to decline. The brain drain from rural areas and old industrial towns is a major social and political problem. We have an economy that rewards leaving. The medieval world was the complete opposite. It was an economy of staying put. For the vast majority of people, the peasants or serfs who worked the land, moving was not an option. They were legally tied to the manor where they were born. They could not leave without the Lord's permission. This was a system of profound unfreedom, but for the artisans and merchants in the towns, while they were legally free to move, the entire economic and social system was designed to encourage stability. The guild system, the importance of local reputation, and the focus on the local market all meant that your economic security was tied to your community. To leave was to abandon your network, your reputation, and your customers. The economy was built on a foundation of stability, not mobility. As the economic historian S.R. Epstein showed, while there were itinerant workers and long-distance traders, the core of the economy was local and deeply rooted in place. The idea of being tied to one place was seen as a form of bondage that we thankfully escaped. The freedom of movement is a celebrated modern, right? We created national and international markets that made local ties less important. We built an education system that prepared people for jobs that could be anywhere. We celebrated the dynamic, restless entrepreneur who was always on the move. We forgot that there might be any value in staying put, but now a powerful counter-movement is emerging. It is a movement that argues that staying put is a radical and necessary act. The author and activist Wendell Berry has been a major voice for this idea for decades. He argues for a place-based economy, one that is rooted in the health of a local community and a local ecosystem. This is the idea behind the buy local movement. It is an attempt to rebuild the dense web of economic relationships that a mobile global economy has destroyed. Instead of buying food that has traveled thousands of miles, you buy from a farmer you know. Instead of banking with a multinational corporation, you use a local credit union that invests in your community. This is not just about sentimentality. Proponents argue that local economies are more resilient, more equitable, and more environmentally sustainable. The rise of remote work, accelerated by the pandemic, is a fascinating new twist. For the first time, many people can choose where they live without having to move for a job. This could lead to a revitalization of smaller towns and rural areas as people choose to move to places with a higher quality of life and a stronger sense of community. It is a movement to reroute our lives and our economies in a particular place. This brings us to some difficult trade-offs. Can a place-based economy ever provide the same level of wealth and variety of goods as our current global system? Is the buy local movement a viable path for everyone, or is it a luxury for the affluent who can afford to shop at farmers markets? And as our world faces global problems like climate change and pandemics, is a focus on the local a wise retreat to resilience, or a dangerous turn away from the global cooperation we need to survive? Number 4, should some things not be for sale? In our market-based society, we have a tendency to believe that everything has a price. Almost anything can be bought and sold. You can hire someone to walk your dog, stand in line for you, or write your university essay. Companies can buy the right to pollute the air through carbon trading schemes. In some countries, you can legally sell a kidney. The philosopher Michael Sandel, in his book, What Money Can't Buy, calls this the marketization of everything. The logic of buying and selling is expanding into every corner of our lives. We generally see this as a good thing. Markets are efficient. They allow people to get what they want. Putting a price on something like carbon emissions can be an effective way to manage it. This way of thinking would have been horrifying to most people in the medieval period. Their world was full of things that were explicitly not for sale. The most important of these was salvation. In the Catholic Church, the practice of selling indulgences, a remission of punishment for sins, became widespread in the late Middle Ages. You could essentially pay money to the church to reduce your time in purgatory. This practice became a major source of corruption and was one of the key triggers for the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther, in his Neti 5 Theses of 1517, argued furiously that God's grace could not be bought and sold. It was a gift that had to be earned through faith, not purchased with coin. This was a profound rejection of market logic in the spiritual realm. Similarly, positions of power in the church or government, known as offices, were not supposed to be for sale. The practice of buying them, known as simony, was considered a grave sin. Of course, these rules were often broken, but the key point is that there was a strong moral and philosophical framework that insisted that some of the most important things in life stood outside the market. The rise of market society eroded this framework. The argument that markets are the most efficient way to allocate resources became dominant. The idea that some things are sacred or priceless came to be seen as sentimental and irrational. If someone is willing to sell and someone is willing to buy, what is the problem? The economist's way of thinking, based on utility and efficiency, replaced the theologian's way of thinking, based on morality and sacredness. But now we are seeing a major pushback against the marketization of everything. We are starting to rediscover the medieval idea that some things should be protected from the logic of buying and selling. The debate over the privatization of things like water, healthcare, and education is a key battleground. Is healthcare a commodity to be sold for a profit, or is it a human right that should be available to all, regardless of their ability to pay? Should education be treated as a consumer product or as a public good essential for a functioning democracy? There is a growing movement against the commercialization of childhood, protesting against advertising targeted at kids. There are fierce debates about whether we should allow markets in human organs or surrogate motherhood. These are all modern versions of the fight against indulgences and simony. They are attempts to draw a line and say, the market is a useful servant, but it is a terrible master. Some things are not for sale. This forces us to confront some of the deepest questions about our values. Where do we draw the line between what can be bought and sold and what cannot? Who decides? If we take things like healthcare or education out of the market, how do we pay for them and ensure they are provided efficiently and with high quality? And is it possible for a society to be both prosperous and humane, to harness the power of markets without letting them corrupt the things that give our lives meaning? Number 3, does fair have a price? What is a fair price for a cup of coffee? In our economy, the answer is simple. The fair price is whatever you are willing to pay for it. It is the price set by the forces of supply and demand. If a new cafe opens and sells coffee for less, the price at the old cafe will have to come down. If a frost in Brazil damages the coffee crop, the price will go up. The price is just information about scarcity and demand. It has no moral content. This idea is the foundation of modern economics. The market price is, by definition, the right price. This is a complete reversal of 1,000 years of economic thought. For the medieval theologian, the price of a good was a profoundly moral issue. As we have seen, the central concept was the just price, justum pretium, most famously articulated by Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica. The just price was not determined by supply and demand. It was determined by the costs of production, including the labor of the artisan, and a small margin to allow his family to live at a level appropriate to their station in life. To sell something for more than it was worth just because the buyer was desperate or ignorant was a sin. To buy something for less than it was worth, just because the seller was in trouble, was also a sin. The goal of a price was not to maximize profit, but to maintain fairness and social order. To enforce this, guilds often set official prices for goods. The authorities would regulate the price of essential commodities like bread. The assize of bread and ale, a 13th century English law, set the price of a loaf of bread relative to the price of wheat. This was a state-enforced just price. The idea of a just price was a major obstacle to the development of capitalism. It was attacked by early modern thinkers as inefficient and impossible to calculate. How could anyone know what the true value of something was? The market, they argued, was a much better way to discover the price. The law of supply and demand replaced the moral law of the just price. This was a huge change. It made our economy incredibly dynamic and efficient, but it also removed any ethical considerations from the act of pricing. Price gouging during an emergency, for example. Selling a bottle of water for $20 after a hurricane is a perfectly logical outcome of a pure supply and demand system. But the medieval idea of the just price is making a powerful comeback. We see it every time we see a product labeled fair trade. The entire purpose of the fair trade movement is to reject the market price in favor of a just price. It is a voluntary system where consumers agree to pay more for products like coffee, chocolate, and bananas, to ensure that the producers in developing countries receive a price that covers their costs of sustainable production and provides a living wage. It is a direct modern application of Aquinas' theory. We also see the ghost of the just price in our laws against price gouging. After a natural disaster, it is illegal in many places to suddenly jack up the prices of essential goods. We instinctively feel that this is wrong, that it is a form of exploitation. This is our medieval moral intuition clashing with modern economic theory. The debates around predatory lending, where lenders charge exorbitant interest rates to desperate borrowers, are also about the just price. We are asking, what is a fair price for a loan? This revival leaves us in a complicated place. Is it possible to build a large-scale economy on the idea of a just price, or will it always be a niche market for ethically minded consumers? If we start to regulate prices based on fairness, do we risk creating shortages, black markets, and a less efficient economy? And the most challenging question of all, if the market price is not always the right price, how do we decide what is fair and who gets to make that decision? Number 2, is it a sin to charge interest? Our entire global economy is built on interest. When you put money in a savings account, you expect to earn interest. When you take out a loan for a car or a house, you expect to pay interest. Companies borrow money to expand. Governments borrow money to fund public services. The interest rate is one of the most important numbers in the economy, set by central banks to manage inflation and growth. The whole system of finance, from a simple credit card to the most complex derivative, is based on the idea that lending money should generate a return. This is so fundamental to our world that it is almost impossible to imagine an economy without it. And yet, for most of Western history, charging any interest on a loan was considered a grave sin. It was called usury. The prohibition against usury has deep roots in the Old Testament. In the medieval period, the Catholic Church condemned it in the strongest possible terms. The reasoning was based on the philosophy of Aristotle, as interpreted by thinkers like Thomas Aquinas. They argued that money is barren. It does not naturally reproduce. A cow can have a calf. A field can grow wheat. But a gold coin, left by itself, does not create more gold coins. Therefore, to charge a fee for the use of money was like charging for time. It was seen as a form of theft, an exploitation of someone's need. A person who borrows money is usually in distress. To profit from their distress was seen as morally repugnant. Of course, the prohibition was often ignored, and clever ways were found around it. But the powerful stigma against usury shaped the medieval economy for centuries and slowed the development of modern finance. The prohibition against usury was gradually broken down. Protestant reformers like John Calvin argued that a reasonable rate of interest for a business loan was not usury. The rise of trade and industry created a huge demand for credit, and the old moral objections seemed out of step with the needs of a growing economy. The term usury came to mean not any interest, but only an excessive or exorbitant rate of interest. By the 19th century, most laws against usury had been repealed. We had created a world where interest was not just tolerated, but celebrated as the engine of investment and progress. But the old prohibition is not dead. In fact, it is the basis of a massive and growing global industry, Islamic finance. The Quran, like the Old Testament, forbids usury or riba. Islamic banks, therefore, cannot charge interest. Instead, they have developed a range of other financial instruments based on partnership and risk sharing. For example, instead of giving you an interest-bearing mortgage to buy a house, an Islamic bank might buy the house and sell it to you at a higher price, which you pay in installments. Or it might buy the house in partnership with you, and you gradually buy out the bank's share over time while paying them a form of rent. These are not just tricks to hide interest. They are based on a fundamentally different principle that money should not be made from money alone, but from real economic activity, trade, and enterprise. The lender should share in the risk of the venture, not just receive a guaranteed return. The Islamic finance industry is now worth trillions of dollars. At the same time, in the secular West, there is a growing backlash against what is seen as modern-day usury. Payday lenders who charge annual interest rates that can run into the hundreds or thousands of percent are a major target. There are growing calls for stricter regulations and interest rate caps to protect vulnerable borrowers. This is the medieval debate about usury, alive and well in the 21st century. This leaves us with some truly mind-bending questions. Could a financial system based on risk sharing, like Islamic finance, be more stable and less prone to the kind of speculative bubbles we see in our interest-based system? Is it possible to have a modern, complex economy without credit and interest as we know them? And the most uncomfortable question, is there something fundamentally wrong, something we have forgotten about an economic system that allows people to become fabulously wealthy simply by having money, without ever creating or doing anything of tangible value? Number one, are you living in a monastery? When you think of a medieval monastery, you probably picture a place of quiet prayer, chanting, and contemplation, in a retreat from the world. But a monastery, especially a Benedictine or Cistercian one, was also a highly sophisticated and self-sufficient economic unit. It was a planned community designed for resilience. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, stated that a monastery should, if possible, be self-contained. It should have its own water source, its own mill, its own bakery and workshops for various crafts, so that there may be no necessity for the monks to go about outside. This was a blueprint for a circular economy. The monks grew their own food. They raised their own livestock. They made their own clothes and tools. Waste from one process became an input for another. The goal was not to maximize profit, but to achieve a state of collective self-sufficiency, to provide for the community's needs with a minimum of outside entanglement. These were islands of order and productivity in a chaotic world. They were famous for their technological innovation, particularly in agriculture and water management. They were the original off-grid communities. This monastic ideal of self-sufficiency was made obsolete by the rise of trade and the market economy. Why try to make everything yourself when you can buy it cheaper from someone who specializes in it? The principle of comparative advantage, articulated by the economist David Ricardo in the early 19th century, showed that everyone is better off if they specialize in what they do best and trade with others. Self-sufficiency came to be seen as a form of poverty. A modern wealthy economy is one with a deep and complex division of labor connected by vast global supply chains. We do not want to be self-sufficient. We want to be interconnected. We want access to coffee from Colombia, electronics from China, and cars from Germany. The monastic ideal was a dead end. Or was it? The idea of a self-sufficient, circular economy is making a stunning comeback, driven by a new set of anxieties: environmental collapse, and the fragility of global supply chains. The COVID-19 pandemic was a brutal lesson in the dangers of overspecialization. Suddenly, we could not get face masks, computer chips, or even lumber, because a factory on the other side of the world had shut down. This has led to a major push for reshoring and building more resilient local supply chains. On a smaller scale, you see the monastic ideal in the homesteading and off-grid living movements. These are people who are trying to disconnect from complex, fragile systems by producing their own food, generating their own energy with solar panels, and managing their own waste. On a larger, more conceptual scale, the most powerful modern heir to the monastic ideal is the concept of the circular economy. The idea, championed by organizations like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, is to redesign our entire industrial system to be like a natural ecosystem. Products are designed to be durable, repairable, and reusable. At the end of their life, they are not thrown away to become waste. They are disassembled and their materials are used to make new products. Waste is eliminated. The system runs on renewable energy. It is the rule of Saint Benedict applied to the entire planet. Whole companies like Patagonia, which encourages customers to repair their clothes rather than buy new ones, are pioneers in this new way of thinking. And cities are developing urban farming projects to increase their food self-sufficiency. This is the monastic vision, reborn for an age of ecological limits. And so we are left with the final, most shocking questions. Is the whole 400-year experiment with a globalized, growth-obsessed, hyper-specialized economy coming to an end? Are we being forced by the pressures of climate change and resource depletion to retreat into more local, more resilient, more self-sufficient communities to build, in effect, a world of monasteries? And what will we have to give up in terms of convenience, variety, and individual freedom to achieve the collective security that the monks sought 1,000 years ago? The past, it seems, is not done with us yet.